Everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and we are live. I'm just going to give my page a couple seconds to load so that we can go ahead and get started with this presentation. So, today I am talking about the 5 shifts to effective social skills intervention. And I wanted to share this special presentation for you just because we've been getting a lot of questions lately about just coping during this time. I know that a lot of our intervention has changed because we are not fully integrated in our normal social situations. And I actually created this presentation a while back and really designed it for students who have those social pragmatic issues. And the thing is that even now, as we are partially quarantined, just trying to get back to things, socially distancing, and all of those things, a lot of these tenets still apply. So I wanted to share this video and also share a special offer that I have going on for anybody who wants to take this a step further. So today I'm talking about the 5 shifts to effective social skills intervention. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So obviously who this is for anybody who is working with individuals that have disabilities that impact their ability to function in social situations. So people who have high functioning autism or other disabilities that impact their social pragmatic functioning. So, what I'm going to show you and talk about today in this short presentation are the top mistakes practitioners are making when it comes to social skills training and how to turn things around if you notice that you might be making some of them, or if you feel like things just aren't quite working when it comes to your social skills intervention. I'm also going to talk about some of the common misconceptions about individuals with autism and other disabilities that impact social skills, and why a lot of this particular misconception is really just total BS, just to be frank. We'll also talk about the essential piece of any effective social skills training regimen. If you don't have this skill, your students will really never generalize what you teach them. And then also the most obvious but overlooked tenet of social skills intervention that will impact whether your students will succeed or fail in school and in life in general, obviously. So, my promise to you is that I'll share some aha moments that I've had as I have worked with this population and some key insights I use to help my students go from really struggling in social situations, spending lunch and recess alone and not really sure what to do, to really developing some thriving friendships and really succeeding in school and their social situations. So, obviously, if you're here and you're still watching, you probably know why this matters, but just a couple key statistics that really just drive this home. One out of five, or one out of 58 8-year-olds has autism, according to the 2018 CDC autism incidence rate statement from Autism Society. And obviously, it's 2020 now as I'm recording this, so that may have gone up. And during 2014 to 2016, the prevalence of children that have ever been diagnosed with any developmental disability significantly increased. And again, these statistics were taken from a couple years ago, so it's likely that given the trend that they may be still going up. So this is really important. There are a lot of individuals that do struggle with these social skills, and now the emotional impact is more important than ever now that we're having to navigate this whole landscape of, trying to figure out how to be social and safe at the same time. So, obviously, some of the things that are impacted, which have become even more important in this past year, are that all of those conditions that I've mentioned, particularly autism, but there are other disabilities that can impact cognition and one's ability to function in a social situation. So, obviously, there are things like control and regulation, being aware of your surroundings and other people around you, your focus and attention and ability to transition. Now, because we have so much independent learning going on, at home learning, things like that, the ability to focus and pay attention to directions has become more important than ever. Same with things like organization, memory, and time management, all of which are impacted if an individual has some social cognitive issues, or some difficulties functioning within those situations. Emotional control and frustration, social functioning, and obviously learning disabilities. So, if you have students that struggled with any of these things, then likely they were probably having a hard time before, but now they're probably having an even harder time because this has been a stressful year. So it's more important than ever for you to know how to support this population. So, what's possible with the right support? I always like to share some success stories here. So, they're kind of a list of famous people who have been reported to have high functioning autism and other related disabilities. Obviously, everybody who is in the autism community knows Temple Grandin, who has become hugely successful in her career. But there's also people like Dan Aykroyd, who actually used some of the aspects of his personality to actually really succeed in his career, in comedy and acting. Emily Dickinson, who was a famous poet, and then John Elder Robison, who wrote the book Look Me in the Eye, and other books where he talks about his experiences growing up with an Asperger's diagnosis. And again, has been extremely successful, and but really had to learn how to navigate his the way that he sees the world so that he can be successful. And all of these things are a testament to what is possible when an individual has the right support and is gets intervention from a position of acceptance and empowerment to them. But what happens without support? Well, obviously, if they don't have the right support, they end up growing up confused, feeling like there's something wrong with them, not really sure how to navigate the world and how to make sense of all the different social interactions that are going on around them. So we don't want that to happen. Obviously, if you're here, you probably have some students who are struggling, who aren't exactly sure how to navigate that landscape and how to navigate some of those unwritten rules. So wanted to talk about a couple things today just to shift your focus. So, obviously, some things that are very common that I've heard from my readers. And so, if any of this sounds like you, you are these things that I'm going to say today will definitely apply to you. So, if you have students who don't make progress, no matter how many times you have explained the rules and how to behave in certain situations, or that don't exhibit what we would commonly consider, and this is, I'm using my quote fingers, you can't see me, but no matter how many times we've explained the quote correct or expected way of behaving, no matter how many behavioral charts and incentives you've given them, they just can't quite figure out how to modify their behavior. If you secretly worry that these interventions don't really work and maybe you're just wasting your time and also wasting your students' time and making them more frustrated, if you dread the thought of them continuing to struggle, and if those students are sometimes losing motivation with what you're working on with them, and then also if you just feel like you're always searching for a solution but really feel like you're disappointed in the options out there, or you're worried that your students are going to go through life without the skills that they need to make friends, have a significant other, hold down a steady job, all of those things that are required, or that require you to be able to relate to other people and function within a social situation. So the real problem, if you've had any of those issues before, is not that you're ineffective or that you haven't found some miracle cure. It's just that you haven't made these shifts that I'm going to talk about today. So once you make these shifts, that's when it finally becomes possible to see your students relating to other people in a more functional, authentic way. You'll see that they actually care about what you're teaching them and start to apply themselves better. You'll realize that the challenges your students are having are just really minor bumps in the road that they have the capacity to adapt in ways that you've never imagined, and most importantly, that you'll feel excitement about actually showing up to your sessions with those students. So let me move on to this part right here. So there are 5 key shifts in what successful practitioners believe about serving this population, and I wanted to share them with you today. So the first shift, and again, like I said, these things they're so obvious, but we forget them. It's just that people with autism spectrum disorder and other disorders that impact social functioning want to have relationships with other people. They just don't know how. And I know, again, it's so obvious, but so many people who I have interacted with, and it might not be necessarily the SLPs or the practitioners that are trying to come up with interventions. It might be other people on the team or other teachers that really don't understand them, or maybe even at like different coaches or parents that they are working with, or just other people that they're interacting with, don't realize that it's not that they are antisocial, that they don't want to have friends. It's just that they aren't exactly sure how to do it. And they have had negative experiences, and that's just kind of reinforced this self-fulfilling prophecy because they haven't been successful before. And so it's kind of an endless cycle. I wanted to share a couple case studies here to just illustrate this point. And this is not the student's real name. I'll call him George. He was at the time in 2nd grade, and he was having fights every day at recess. And he would come in, and he had speech right after recess. He'd come into my room all mad, and the recess monitor just wasn't sure. It was like, maybe he just doesn't like to play the games with the other kids. I don't know. And so when we actually dug into it, what we found was that he really, really, really wanted to play kickball with his friends, but there was something about they were modifying the rules because they knew that the other kids knew we only have 20 minutes at recess. We've got to make this, figure out a way to get this game in and move it along so that we can all actually have a turn. And so they were modifying the rules, and it was driving him crazy. And he had no idea how to navigate that situation. And so he was just getting so mad and yelling at all the kids, and then they didn't want him to play, and he didn't want to play, and it was just this whole thing. So really he wanted to be involved in that situation. He didn't want to be storming off like he was every day, but he just did not quite have the skills to be able to regulate himself and then respond and ask questions and advocate for himself or ask questions and just really navigate that situation. And so, perfect example, once we explained this to him, talked him through it, and showed him how to actually navigate the situation appropriately, he was able to actually engage just fine, and started doing much better. Gave him that time to engage with his friends. Another case study, there was another student who, again, elementary age student, who really was into bugs. And he was, again, recess monitor is concerned. He's off by himself, not interacting with the other kids. And, she's thinking like, maybe he's not interested in playing with the other kids. Well, he was just really into his bug thing. He didn't quite understand that how to go up to another kid and start a conversation and have a reciprocal, like, sometimes we do what you want to do, sometimes we do what I want to do. And he would just go up to kids and just start talking about bugs without any appropriate introduction to the conversation, and the other kids would just be confused and thrown off and would just walk away. And so again, it was a skill-based issue. He did not know how to start a conversation. And so he just gave up and was like, all right, I'm going to go over here and look at my bugs. So again, not that he didn't want to, he just did not know how to navigate that situation. Once we talked him through it, he was able to cope a lot better and figure out how to actually have some reciprocal conversations and be able to talk with kids about things that they also were mutually interested in instead of just what he wanted to do. So again, perfect example. On the surface, it looked like these kids just don't want to play with the other kids, but really it was just that they didn't quite know how to navigate the situations. So first thing, again, obviously, is that they want to. More often than not that they want to, they just don't know how to. So let's move on to the second shift. So that is, again, just leads right in. If we want children with disabilities that impact their pragmatic language, their social cognitive skills, if we want them to have effective social skills, we need to teach them to have effective social skills. And again, forgive me if that sounds painfully obvious, but a lot of times you would think with both of those situations that I just explained, both of those kids had access. They could observe what the other kids were doing. All the other kids out there had figured out how to navigate, how to talk to your friends and invite another kid to play with you at recess. But those other two that I mentioned hadn't picked up on that just from simple observation. They did not. They needed more explicit teaching of those skills, and I think that sometimes we forget that. We're like, well, they're integrated and they have experiences all the time. They should just figure it out. Well, no. Sometimes if they're not picking up on it, we do need to teach those skills. And so that brings up the difference between implicit learning versus explicit learning. Implicit meaning that we observe it and we just implicitly, without directly talking about it, just kind of figure it out from being in the situation. Explicit being that somebody sits us down and actually step by step explains it to us. So with those particular students, we need to be more explicit with them. Actually, I just realized as I clicked on this slide, there should be an H in his name. It's for John Elder Robison. Again, the author that I mentioned before, he talks about in one of his books that he struggled, all the way through his school experience, and that he saw his diagnosis not as a hindrance to him, but clarity, so that it was like, okay, I've been given this diagnosis, and there are some specific interventions and roadmaps that will show me how to navigate this and how to teach myself how to work through these situations. And again, he said, I wish that someone would have just sat me down and explained these things to me, because then it could have saved me a lot of struggle when I was in high school. So again, perfect example of wanting to interact, but also not exactly knowing how, and needing someone to just sit you down and saying, this is how you act in these certain situations. And I know that it's like a lot of people should know these things, but I think you might know it as a practitioner, but I think sometimes we need to get other people on board with it and just remind ourselves of it, that yes, it does need to be more explicit. Just exposure is not always enough. So let's move on to the third shift. I love this one because, so obviously we've gotten to the point where it's like, all right, we know that they care about this. We need to be direct with them. We can't just let them figure it out and throw them into the situation. And they might not just figure it out with certain situations if they're struggling. But the other thing is that appropriate and effective are not the same thing. And so here's what I mean by that. And that is that we get this idea of how we should act, what, quote, normal behavior is. And that might not be the best way to go about doing things for these particular students who are struggling. If something is appropriate, it means that this is what society has been deemed acceptable in this certain situation, which sometimes for good reason, but sometimes it's just because that's what we've gotten used to. It's like this is the way we've always done it kind of thing. And so a lot of times kids who are struggling in social situations have found a behavior that is effective for them in doing and serving a certain purpose, but it might not be what we consider appropriate and desirable. Perfect example would be a student does not want to do their work, so they hide under their desk. Well, that is not an appropriate behavior, but it's effective in that moment because they don't have to do a thing that they don't want to do. So explaining to them that this is the right and wrong way to do things, it's not enough of a motivator to them to just tell them this is the way that we do things. We need to really get clear on, is this something that is effective? Is this behavior something that is more effective than that appropriate behavior that we're trying to teach? And then I think also it's a matter of figuring out, all right, um, just because this is the ideal behavior that we want to see, is there something that might be close enough to whatever the desirable behavior that we think that they should be doing? Or is there something that's kind of a step in the right direction for that student that is just as effective and functional for them? So one perfect example, um, I had a student who, again, she was very she again had a hard time coming up with certain common ground when she was having conversations with people. And so she would just walk around and have a conversation with herself. And to her, that seemed totally normal and appropriate because she was meeting that need. It was like, I'm entertained, I get to talk about what I want to. It didn't occur to her that people might think that this is strange for me to be talking out loud to myself. And so what we ended up doing is that we didn't totally curb the behavior. We just told her, that if you're walking around talking to yourself, people might think that's unusual. It might impact whether or not they want to talk to you. And so that helped her to make that connection of, well, this might not be something that that a lot of people do out loud, but it's maybe I can just do it in certain situations when there aren't a lot of people around me. So we started shaping the behavior so that it was more appropriate or more functional for her. And there are a lot of other examples, but I think there are a lot of times when we are really rigid in what we think is acceptable. And sometimes a student might actually be getting closer to a more appropriate behavior. And by curbing it or punishing them when they're actually getting closer to where we want them, we're actually putting a deterrent on their progress. So another example would be, I had a student who was initially, when he would get upset, he would do something self-injurious like hit himself, or sometimes he would be physically violent with other students. And then we got him to the point where he wasn't doing that anymore, but sometimes he would swear. And so obviously swearing isn't good, and we still had to continue shaping that behavior. But on the outside, it looked like, wow, this is really inappropriate. But at the same time, he was using words instead of physical violence. So we were getting closer. So when we were thinking about the consequences of that behavior, obviously we couldn't just, let him yell the F word out in the middle of English class, but we could at least acknowledge that he was getting closer. We at least were getting rid of one of the old behaviors, and we could shape it into something that was going to be less disruptive. And I think that that's a really good example of the swearing thing is a really good example of the appropriate versus functional as well, where if nobody's around and the kid yells a swear, it's like, okay, it's not ideal, but at the same time, we have to kind of modify things and be aware of when students are making that progress. Let me move on to the fourth shift so that we can keep moving here. So we're already at 3:30. So the fourth shift is just knowledge of what constitutes effective or appropriate social skills is not enough. And this just builds on the last one, we want to also think about what is a functional equivalent for that particular student. Um, Sometimes, and with those examples that I gave just earlier, we might accept a certain behavior because we know that for this particular student, that is going to be an effective means of working through a certain situation. It might not be what we think is the perfect ideal way to act, but it might be something that is perfectly effective for that student. So that's something that we want to keep in mind as well. So I'm going to move along to the fifth shift here. And this is something that's really important to realize as we're trying to figure out why is a student doing what they're doing, and is this behavior appropriate for them? Are they moving in the right direction? Just being aware that successful social interaction depends on integrating all three of these things. So there's the thinking aspect, so the cognitive aspect of knowing what to actually do in certain situations. And then there is the emotional impact of actually being in that situation and how that impacts how that person might be able to take that knowledge that they know based on their thinking and cognition and then actually apply it. Perfect example, if you're super anxious, obviously that's going to impact your ability to behave in a certain way. Sometimes we know that one way of doing things is not going to be the best way of acting, but we do it anyways because our emotions get the best of us. And then maybe we might also be in a certain situation, somebody responds a certain way that we're not expecting, and then that causes us to have different feelings about that particular situation. And then whatever happens in those social situations, what happens a lot for our students on the spectrum and other related disorders that impact social skills, they're in a situation and they have a negative experience that generates a negative feeling about that situation. And then they form some type of interpretation about that. And that's going to impact what they actually do in that situation. And that's going to impact what they think about that situation. So it kind of goes around and around in circles. Again, that self-fulfilling prophecy, emotions and feeling impacts what we do. And then what we do impacts what actually happens. And then that makes us think certain things. So we kind of go around and around. And a lot of times in our intervention, we're focusing mostly on the thinking and just telling kids what they should do. And we're not paying attention to what they're feeling and why they're doing what they're doing. And so a lot of times with navigating, like, is this an appropriate behavior? Is it functional? Is it effective enough for now? Is it maybe not exactly the way that we would do it in a certain situation, but maybe perfectly functional for this student based on what they want to be doing? All of these things, just thinking about it in this way can help us problem solve through those particular things. And the thing is that what we can't actually see everything that's happening. We only see the behaviors. We only see the surface level thing. We can't necessarily see what they're thinking, and see what they're feeling. So that's why we've got to dig deeper into these behaviors and why they're happening, rather than just sticking superficial and give them a mark on their chart when they don't behave in the exact right way that we want to. Because again, over time, we're going to accumulate emotions based on our experience, and that's just going to impact how we act. So when we're just teaching and just dealing with that cognitive aspect of this is how you should act in this certain situation, we're not getting that full picture. So again, we think, feel, and do simultaneously. So we've got to think about all those things. So why so many social skills interventions don't work is because they don't necessarily take all those things into account. And most interventions don't address all three of those things. And a lot of times they don't focus on integrating all three of those things together. So that is really important. And so that's why that's such an important shift to make. So there's one more shift that I wanted to talk about today. So again, first we've got that kids who struggle with social pragmatic skills, they want to have friends, they want to have relationships, they just don't know how. The second shift is that we have to teach them social skills if we want them to learn effective social skills. Three is that appropriate and effective are not the same thing. And so that is why sometimes behaviors that we might perceive as negative persist because they're effective, even if they're not appropriate. And then number four is when we're trying to figure out how to shape that behavior, we have to figure out what is appropriate and effective for that student based on where they are and based on how they're progressing and what's important to them, not necessarily what's important to us. So the fifth shift is that in order for individuals with social skills challenges, for whatever reason, we need a roadmap to guide them on the right path. And then, obviously, if what we're doing isn't working, we need to make sure that we find a different path. And a lot of times, again, there are really subtle shifts and ways that we can actually analyze what's going on and just look at things from a different framework. So I wanted to share a framework that's really been helpful in diagnosing where the actual issue is. And sometimes we know that things aren't going how we want because the student is struggling, but we're not exactly sure why. And so a lot of times I get the question of, well, what goals should I write? And a lot of times that's putting the cart before the horse. And this is just an example of sometimes, you get these goals where it's like student will improve social skills with 80% accuracy. And it's like, well, what does that even mean? What skills are we actually addressing? Where is the student actually not functioning where they should? The way to do that is that you want to figure out what skills you're teaching. The strategies, the goals that you write aren't even relevant if you don't know what you're teaching. So if you're not teaching, so again, why do so many students fail to make progress with social skills training? Well, a lot of times it's not addressing the right skills, or it's maybe only addressing a tiny, tiny piece of the skill that the student needs. So the way that you actually start forming that roadmap, before you can even write goals and pick strategies, you've got to figure out, okay, what are the different areas that I can actually use to figure out what skills the student needs to work on. And so we want to look at it from a perspective of these broad categories. So the first category is nonverbal communication. So any type of nonverbal behaviors, we've got to figure out if our student is able to read and utilize nonverbal behaviors. Perfect example of how you can get too myopic in your thinking is all these eye contact goals. A lot of times it's not really an issue that the student needs to make better eye contact or needs to be making eye contact 90% of the time or whatever. It's that they don't understand nonverbal communication. So we're actually being too rigid and narrow in our focus. If we're just focusing on eye contact, a lot of times they need to be addressing more the global overall category of nonverbal communication. That's really more the issue rather than eye contact. So they're not making progress because you're just focusing on this one tiny little thing over here when it's this big area that they need to be able to read better. Social initiation, again, one of the other things, a lot of times there's these goals about like, we'll carry out a conversation, or, it's kind of vague, but really it's what we have to be able to distinguish is what parts of those interactions is a student struggling with. One key skill where there tends to be an issue is the initiation aspect. So my student who liked bugs was struggling with social initiation. If we were doing just vague social skills training, but not really showing him how to strike up a conversation with somebody, it obviously wouldn't have helped him. And the other thing is reciprocity and terminating interactions. So this is maintaining that conversation and then ending the conversation appropriately. Again, really important for being able to have a conversation, but a different skill than in initiation. So we've got to figure out
how to determine which one it is, and if it's both. Social cognition is just the knowledge of those skills. A lot of times we focus a lot on here just the actual knowledge of what you're supposed to do in certain situations. Super important, but a lot of times people focus too much on this one and not as much on these other ones over here. But it is still important. So, just your actual knowledge of what you're supposed to do in certain situations. Obviously, if you don't know what to do, you're not going to do it. And then self awareness and perspective taking. So, it's not just enough to know what to do, you have to be able to, in the moment, be aware of how well you're actually implementing that knowledge that you have, and pay attention to what you're doing and how it's impacting the other people, looking at that real-time feedback. Doesn't matter how much you explain how to do the thing if that individual doesn't have the ability to pay attention in the moment and get that feedback. And then finally, we've got social anxiety and withdrawal. This is a huge one that's overlooked. A lot of times, the ability to do all of these things are impacted by this anxiety and withdrawal. And that results from just the continued failure in those situations. And again, like I said, that self fulfilling prophecy. A lot of times, when there are issues with motivation and kids that seem like they don't care, it's just that they have just been repeatedly frustrated in those situations. And so we've got to figure out how to mitigate those things as well. So again, just to kind of sum up what I've talked about today, so I've talked about the mistakes that we're making. So really just forgetting that things need to be explicit. For these particular students, we need to be direct in what we teach them, and we need to focus on what skills they actually are struggling with, and also be aware of the difference between appropriate versus effective and functional, and make it tailored to those students' needs. And again, the most common misconception being that they don't care, and we already talked about how that is just not true. And then I also talked about the essential piece of that social skills training regimen, which is knowing how to integrate all those three skills together. So, again, knowing how to integrate thinking, feeling, doing. And then finally, the one of the most obvious but overlooked tenet, and again, that is just that we can't just put students in particular situations and hope that they'll figure it out. If they're struggling, we probably need to be more direct with them. So, really, what you need to quote win, so meaning what you need to set your students up for success, is to recognize these five tenets, which is that people with social language issues, they want relationships, they just don't know how to have them. If we want individuals with autism and other related disabilities to learn successful skills, we need to teach them successful skills. Appropriate is overrated. You want to strive for effective and be aware of if they have behaviors that are really disruptive and not serving them that are effective in some way. You want to figure that out so that you can figure out what is going to be both effective for them but also serve them. We want to be aware of thinking, feeling, and doing. Your framework for intervention needs to address all three. And then those 6 areas of social impairment can function as your roadmap. And if you're on the wrong path, you obviously want to invest in finding the right one. Invest the time in figuring out exactly where your student is struggling so that when you do get to the point of writing goals and picking strategies, that you're picking the right ones. So let me move on to the final thing I wanted to share. Again, I wrote this presentation a couple years ago and wanted to just to share it again because I think it's so important with what we're dealing with right now. There is a lot of, I think, social anxiety going on, so it's really important that we give our students the support that they need to succeed. So, what I am doing this month is that I have a special program called the Social Language Roadmap where I go through exactly how to implement the framework that I talked about today. So, figuring out how to use those 3 areas, thinking, feeling, and doing, how to use those 6 areas of social impairment to come up with really focused, specific goals. And then I walk through picking the right goals and interventions. And then I will show you those intervention tutorials where you will get a roadmap that will help you to pick interventions that are aligned with the areas where your students are struggling so that it is appropriate and functional. And so this will work whether you are using this within a traditional school setting, whether you're if you're providing therapy in the schools, but it's also something that can be tailored regardless of the situation. Even if you are in a remote learning situation, there are tools that you can use that will actually prepare your students for whatever situation they're in. And the thing is that they're not cookie cutter. They are frameworks. They're not, like a pack of social skills cards that are totally generic. I will show you how to customize it because it's not going to work unless it's customized to your students' unique situation. If it's too generic, then it's not going to apply to them. Our students struggle so much with generalization. We've got to make those connections for them and show them how it ties in to their situation. And so the way to do that is to not have a million flashcards or worksheets or printouts that give you pre-made social narratives or whatever, is to understand the components and the framework behind that intervention so that you can quickly implement it and make it tailored toward your students' unique interventions. So what I'm doing is that we actually, the social language roadmap is a course. Normally it's $197, but this month I am actually including it in membership in my SLP Learning Academy program. So SLP Learning Academy is a coaching program for SLPs who want to get more out of their careers. We talk about all different kinds of things in the program. What it includes is an entire training library with all different topics related to speech pathology, from unique case studies to productivity to leadership and collaboration, even things like figuring out how to get to that next stage in your career if you want to start a business, go to a leadership position, make a transition between settings. We talk about all different kinds of things to really help you to tailor and find the right path for you, whether it means staying in your current setting and just being the best clinician you can be, or whether it means building your skills so that you can figure out your next step. And so we do talk a lot about, in the program, there have been some case studies about students who are on the autism spectrum. We've had some great case studies on our coaching calls in SLP Learning Academy. And so that's why I wanted this month to give new members a chance to grab the Social Language Roadmap course. So how it works is, again, SLP Learning Academy is $39 a month, but when you join this month, you'll actually get that Social Language Roadmap included in your membership. So basically, normally it's $197, but all you need to do is just pay for that first month of the SLP Learning Academy, and you'll immediately get access to the Social Language Roadmap. So I've actually got a page that has all the details. I can include it in the comments. Again, SLP Learning Academy is my coaching program for SLPs. When you join, you get access to monthly coaching calls where you can hop on a call and bring questions about case studies and anything that you need relating to the topics that we cover in the program. And then you also get access to our training library and also our digital resources slides that I've just added. So thanks so much, everybody, for listening today. Again, I will share the enrollment page for SLP Learning Academy so that you can learn how to get access to the Social Language Roadmap program for free this month. Thanks so much, everybody, for watching, and have a wonderful day.